Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live. My name's Mot Tuman. I'm going to be your host tonight, and welcome to JL305. We're going to be talking all about illustration and some of the basics to create your own illustrations. But before we get into that, class code for tonight, like I just said, is going to be JL305. So if you go onto JerrysArtarama.com and type into the search bar JL305, it'll bring up the teacher's cart where you'll be able to find all of the materials that I will be using tonight. So if you see anything that interests you or you want to try anything out, that's where you'll be able to find it. But we got a lot of stuff to cover, so let's get right into it. Illustration. I love illustration. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I felt the need to, starting out the show, explain a little bit about what illustration is and how it is a little bit different from other types of art, like the fine art fields. So, illustration, if you think about just like some of the definitions of illustration, one of them, we often use it like, if someone asks, hey, can you illustrate that for me? They might be saying like, hey, can you describe that for me? And illustration really is about description when you think about it. And one of the things that it's most commonly used for is making stories, describing things like this to you. So that's kind of what we're going to be getting into tonight, is how you can tell your own story and how you can illustrate that. Another one of the wonderful things about illustration is that it's often done for reproducibility. So like you're going to make prints of it, it's going to show up in a newspaper, it's going to show up online. That's what makes it the most different from other things like the fine arts field, where it's like you might display something in a gallery, but you're not necessarily going to sell prints of it. That's a little bit different now that we have the wonderful world of the internet and art is everywhere all over the internet all the time. But that's some of the things that makes illustration a little bit different. Part of that reproducibility aspect kind of affects what mediums people tend to use for illustration. So I got two mediums that I want to showcase tonight, one of which is alcohol markers. These are the Artfinity alcohol markers. Alcohol markers are often used for illustration because lots of people, they create really crisp, like even washes of color and everything. If we go to the overhead, I'll show you guys really quickly. Whoops, I have a bunch of papers under there that I completely forgot about. Sketches. I'm just going to show you guys these really quickly, but essentially they're able to create really crisp, even washes of color, and there's not a lot of glare on these. The same is true for acrylic gouache, which is what I did this illustration in. This is acrylic gouache. It's very similar to acrylic, but it's matte, so it's not going to have any of that shininess that acrylic will. You can think of it either as a matte acrylic, or you can think of it as a gouache that does not reactivate. Hence acrylic gouache. So lots of times that's used for illustration because people want to be able to scan their illustrations in. They want to be able to photograph them easily without glare, which is why you often use matte mediums for it. Now this actually has a little bit of lame on it. The Turner acrylic gouache, which is what this is, has lame colors, which are like glitter colors, and I don't know if that's showing up. Oh, you can kind of get it there. Yeah, kind of get it. There's a little bit of a shine on here. So their lame colors are the only colors in the set that aren't matte in the way that the other colors are, just because it has a little bit of glossiness to it and a little bit of glittery shine. So I wanted to put that on there just because it was kind of fun. So I'm going to show you guys this real quick. But what I wanted to do tonight is that I had made this illustration a while back. I just threw it out there. It wasn't planned or anything. I really enjoyed it though. I really like how it turned out. And I decided I want to make like a follow-up to this illustration, like continue the story a little bit. So that story aspect is one of the most important parts of illustration. If you want to focus on storytelling, what kind of story you're going to tell. That's what I had to figure out first. So this illustration I did, we got this dragon coming through this rain. It's really fun. It's cute. It's kind of like a children's book illustration. And all the colors are really muted, and it's kind of, I wanted to give the vibe that this dragon's kind of playful, hence the children's book illustration aspect of it. And so he's coming down, maybe he'll land on this roof, like this guy right here who's sitting, fishing, doesn't seem too scared of him or anything. It's just like, maybe this dragon's really common in this area around this lake, and I'm trying to build this story about what this dragon is and what it's doing. And the ideas that I came up with is that I wanted to have this dragon kind of like peeking through a window, like maybe like intruding into someone's house. Like maybe this dragon is so relaxed in this little like seaside town that it's almost like okay with sneaking into people's houses. And I wanted to have him trying to steal someone's dinner because I thought that would be kind of funny and cute. So I first started out thumbnailing. Thumbnailing is one of the most important steps when you begin any kind of art piece, not just illustrations. But that's really the stage where you're going to figure out your composition, what it looks like, what your colors look like. If I can just flip these around real quick. And for those of you who don't know, a thumbnail is essentially just a very small sketch of whatever you're going to do. You're trying to simplify things, you're trying to keep things very basic, essentially. So this was like a preliminary sketch that I'd done just thinking about what I wanted things to look like. You'll see at the end that my final illustration evolved a lot from this, but I think this was actually the first drawing I did, just in colored pencils. These are the Cezanne colored pencils that I was just scribbling things out with. So I had some guy sitting here, you can only see his head because I didn't bother drawing his body, and this dragon's coming in. Maybe the guy like even expects the dragon and has like laid out a fish for him, maybe they're gonna have dinner together. Just one of the ideas I was throwing around, but I didn't totally like this composition, and this wasn't quite thumbnailing. Like this is a little more large and a little more detailed than I needed to do. You really want to start out simple and you want to start out small and condensed so that like if someone were to step back from your painting, they wouldn't get bogged down in all the details of your composition, they wouldn't get lost in it. You want to focus on showing that person the image and leading their eye around the image the way you want it to go. So that's part of the storytelling aspect, is composition. And composition is essentially, like I said, leading the viewer's eye through the image. And that's a very important part of storytelling. Like if I had, let's say here, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but this is one of the thumbnails that we're going to be working on for this image. I'm going to pull it down so you can hear. So this is a more completed like thumbnail sketch that I did. I'd actually found all my reference images for this and I'd put this together, sketched it out, and then we actually printed this out. This is on Soho marker paper, and I printed out a few of them here. Emmy helped me with this. Thank you, Emmy. So that I can start planning out colors that I want to use and values that I want to use for this. But you can see in this thumbnail that I've got kind of a lot going on here, and it's completely different from the sketches that I started out with. So I got like my old man right here. He's reading what is actually a cookbook, though you can't really see it because it's so small. You have a fish right here on the dinner table. And then here's this window where the dragon is just barely peeking in, and he's got his little bird friend with him because I liked how these seagulls were following him around in this one. I thought it was really cute, and I thought maybe these seagulls are like his friends almost. And so I decided to put one of these seagulls in the window, like hanging out with him while he's trying to steal this guy's fish, essentially. But you can kind of see that the layout is totally different, and I did a lot of things to try and move your eye around in the image. Like I have a knife right here that's kind of pointing you down this way, almost back in the direction of the fish. This kind of leads you up into this windowsill. I have kind of a horizontal line coming across the image here where I put like a picture frame on the wall. That kind of leads you back to the old man. And then I have this bookshelf right here, and I even put a little like mop, broom, walking stick, whatever it is, that kind of leads you back down into the knife. So I'm trying to lead the eye around. That's something you want to have in mind when you're doing your thumbnails. Now, ideally your thumbnails will not start out as detailed as this, because I put a lot of time and effort into making this as detailed and as exact as I wanted. And ideally when you're looking at your first thumbnailing stages, you're not even really going to be thinking about reference images yet or tiny little details. You just want to start getting basically blobs of color out. These are not clear what's going on here. These were my first thumbnails for this because I was only trying to focus on color and how color was going to play in my image. Color is very important in illustrations, and it can do a lot of stuff. One thing that color can do very well is show emotion, how an image kind of feels. So you can see I had these super dark images, and I actually think I was basing them off of one of John Singer Sargent's paintings. I believe it was a woman at a dinner table, because I'd been ideating a bunch and I'd like had this idea of a dragon coming in through the window, but this wasn't an interesting composition to me. It was like dragon, table, man. It was very much like here, here, here. It wasn't like leading the eye around at all. It wasn't a very exciting composition to me, which is why I decided to change it. And the first place I started out looking at was John Singer Sargent's paintings. Not because this style of painting has anything to do with John Singer Sargent, just because he's one of my favorite artists. And that's a place that you can go looking for if you want to find interesting compositions. Look at your own favorite artist, what really attracts you to the image that you're looking at. And so I had found one of his paintings, and I was trying to she was at a dinner table, and I was like, oh, well, what if I set it up similarly to this, where like the dragon's coming in from the back? You can see I took color notes from the painting that he had done, but I kind of decided that it was too dark and too moody, and he had actually had, if I can find So I got a colored pencil right here. When this was on colored pencils, he had actually had it, so I believe the woman in his painting was like pretty far off to the side, and then the table wasn't really the focus. And I was thinking about what I wanted the focus to be in my composition, and I decided that the focus I wanted was the fish, like the star of the show, what the dragon was coming in to steal. Because I had already had this illustration where the dragon was kind of the main focus, and I decided I didn't want another one where he was the main focus. I wanted like more of the story to be told. So introducing more characters, introducing more aspects. I decided I wanted the fish to be the largest part in this image and the thing that took up the most attention, because that's what I wanted people to focus on. Like, why is this dragon coming in a window? If the fish isn't large and prominent, you might not be able to tell. So I decided I didn't want to go the route of this John Cena Sargent painting, and I wanted to change it up a bit for like, I wanted the perspective to be tilted down, like if I squat down a little bit, so that you're almost looking at the table that this fish was going to be on, and that fish would be right up in your face. And then you could see the dragon kind of coming up from behind us. So that's the thumbnails that I started putting down here. You can see my sketching is very rough. These don't have to be clean. They don't have to be perfect. It was very much all over the place. I was trying to figure out how I was going to draw this dragon from the front. He was looking all kinds of wonky. I did really like how this thumbnail turned out, where it's like you have the fish here really prominently. The dragon's kind of like peeking through the window. I tried to get more of that characterization to come out. So how you depict the characters, what their body movement's kind of doing. It's really, if you think about it, it's really like you're thinking of your characters as actors. And you're thinking about what an actor might do in this situation. So I wanted my dragon to be like peeking in, like almost curiously, and his foot that's coming down is like almost reaching towards the fish. And I really did like that at first. And I had the old guy here. I decided it would be an old man because I was like, this is a fishing town. Maybe you have like an old gruff fisherman. And I kind of had him a little too far off to the side. So I think I wanted to build in a little more space. Because like I said before, I didn't want the dragon to be the main focus of this. I wanted like to introduce more characters and have the dragon kind of like peeking in from the background. And this composition was also very much like dragon-centric, which was fine. But I ended up changing courses a little further down the road, but we'll get to that. But you can see here, I also started sketching out and finding references because I was having a more defined idea of what I wanted this illustration to be. So I had found a reference picture of an old man. And you can see here, I drew him out in red, and then I started drawing him out in blue, and he ended up with like a funky red-looking nose. But I found a reference image for him. I was sketching him out and trying to plan what I wanted him to look like. And then I also tried to plan out like what this was going to be an interior room. And the thing about illustrating interiors that I find a lot of people get caught up on is how you fill the space. Because oftentimes we think, oh, we get a room, and then all of a sudden we have to put a bunch of stuff in the room. And if you don't put enough, it doesn't feel like it's lived in. So even if you look around your own house and think about all the different things that you might have to draw or you might have to come up with if you are illustrating a room from your imagination, it's quite a bit. We like to decorate things. We like to have little objects laying around. So that's part of what I started thinking about in this image right here. It's like, this is an old man on a seaside town. Maybe he has like a nice antique bookshop. He's reading a book. Maybe he likes books. So I put a ton on the shelf. And I was like, normally in my house, I have things sitting on top of my bookshelf as well. So I was like, what objects can I put on top of this bookshelf? So I put like a little tackle box. This was like my very rough sketch of a trophy. Like maybe he'd won a trophy for fishing or something. It's just like little details like that you can kind of go into an illustration and explore and not have to like make someone stay there for a while and find out more about the story, essentially. So I'd also had like a little hat here because the reference image I ended up picking out of the old man, he was losing a lot of his hair, as you could see in this. So I was like, it'll be good if he has a hat since he's a fisherman. So I had done kind of all that work, and that took a lot of time. And you can even see here, this was kind of my final thumbnail for the image that I wanted to create. And this actually ended up changing a lot during the painting process. And I'm gonna tell you right now, ideally, you will get your sketch kind of planned out thoroughly before you even really get into color and value. You'll have a good idea of what you want done. I still ended up changing this even after I started painting, and that kind of got into its own problems. But this is where I ended up starting from. So I wanted to show you guys a little bit. I changed things around a little bit in these thumbnails. That I did a more defined sketch. I got all my reference pictures together. Hopefully you guys can see this well. But I had figured out the proportion of my fish. I'd started thinking a lot more about perspective. If you don't know perspective, you haven't taken any classes on perspective, let me know if you're interested in that, because it's easy, but it's also complicated. Like, it's super complicated till you get it, then it feels really easy. But the perspective is very important for figuring out what exactly you want your image to be. So this is kind of the thumbnail that I ended up going with. I pushed the dragon further back. He wasn't peering through the window anymore, because I had figured out at some point, actually I'll show you guys this, I had started painting this out with acrylic gouache, and came up with this somewhat monstrosity, not a monstrosity, but you can see here, this was a bit of a mess. I ended up having to abandon this, because if you've ever worked with acrylic gouache, something that's very important to know is that if it becomes too thick, it will start to crack. And that is what happened with this painting, because I layered and layered and layered. I kept changing things that I should have been changing in my thumbnail stage, not in my actual painting stage. And so I kept redoing things, and acrylic gouache is great at like blocking out mistakes and everything like that. Like, it really powers over objects. But again, layered it too thickly and it started cracking just a little bit. But you can see here, at this point, I had actually painted the dragon in the window coming through and everything. And you can actually feel and even kind of still see where those brushstrokes were if you looked really closely at this. Like I said before, though, acrylic gouache is really great at photographing, so you can't actually see it at all at the camera, which I'm very grateful for. But I'd found, like, if this dragon was coming through this window as far as he was, and I had this very prominent knife on the counter because this man was supposed to be cooking, and I wanted other tools to infer that he was cooking besides just a fish on a cutting board. And I was like, okay, there's a large knife and there's a dragon coming through the window. What does that imply? And it was looking very scary, which wasn't really the story I wanted to get at. It was an interesting story to tell, but it was looking kind of scary. I was like, it was kind of implying that this dragon was going to come in to steal this guy's fish, and is this guy going to attack the dragon? Is he going to defend himself? It was a fun story to explore, but it wasn't the one that I was going for, which is why I ended up pushing the dragon further back in space and having him just like peeking in the window. And I even ended up putting in, if you can see on this sketch of my redo right here, barely see it, I put a like title on the book he was reading. So it wasn't just a generic book, but it was like a cookbook for dragons. So he's cooking a meal for his dragon friend, and it's a little bit cuter and a little more friendly, little more like a children's book than like this guy is gonna have a fight with this dragon coming through the window. So this was my first painting, and there's a lot of things that went wrong with this. There was a lot of problems with color that I was facing. I had chose a reference image where the man was lit from the front when I needed him lit from the back. And so I spent a lot of time, this big blob of paint here is me trying to figure out what color I needed his face to be so that it would look like it was in shadow. That's part of the reason why it started cracking, because I just kept putting new colors over and over and over again. But I had to essentially completely restart that. So I don't want you to get to that trouble. So figure things out in your thumbnail stage. Do what I'm going to show you how to do right now, which is taking like a big sketch of your illustration, printing it out on paper. I have some New York Central watercolor paper right here, and this is the Soho marker paper. And then figuring out value and color after you've gotten your sketch, after you've gotten the perspective and everything taken care of, so you won't have to deal with the issues that I dealt with. But I'm gonna get into showing you guys a little bit of a value study and how I finally figured out the values that I wanted to put in here so I could make the composition move around that way I wanted it to. I know I've been talking a lot right now, so if we have any questions, let me know. But I also know that this is just a lot of information that you guys, I don't know how familiar are you guys, how interested are you guys in illustration? Because I know we're very much a fine arts company, but illustration is one of the things, like, I love looking at illustrations. I love the storytelling aspect behind them. Not that fine art doesn't tell stories, but it's just the thing that excites me most about art is the storytelling aspect. So let me know, or let me know if you have any like good children's book or anything that you love because of the story in it or because of the illustrations. I would love to look at that. Okay, so I'm gonna start out in black and white. I'm gonna use the Artfinity markers for this just so I can throw down values really quickly. And I think I'm gonna go with, this is the 150 set. So there's a bunch of neutral grays in this, and there's a bunch of warm and cool grays. I think I'm gonna stick to the neutral, to the cool side of things. I'm just gonna pull a bunch of them out now. So I think where I wanna start is the spot I had the most issue with. which is his face. And hopefully you guys will see this a little bit better as I start to put values in. But I think I'm going to start with a nice mid-tone, because I don't want his face to be like so dark that you can't see any details in it because the shadow is so incredibly dark, but I do want it to be like, still look like it's in shadow. So I think I'm going to use the neutral gray 4 for this, and the caps on these do a pretty good job showing you what the color looks like. So I'm actually just going to jump right in and start shading in his face a little bit with this marker. And this is the neutral gray. Something that's fun and good to think about in this stage is warm versus cool. So before you even start putting the tones of your color in, like warm versus cool can help distinguish different areas from each other. So in this painting that I had done originally, everything was kind of cool and I had little warm moments, like this knife was very warm and that's what's drawing a bunch of attention to it. And I decided I wanted to distinguish a little bit more between like warm and cool. Especially like some of these colors back here were very much muddy. And like this is warm, but this is much more of a cooler tone, and it's confusing because like we have this nice cool window coming in. Why is the wall right next to this nice cool window warmer than this one over here that's farther away? Those are like little things you have to start thinking about, and so it's a good idea to start working them out here. So I'm gonna start throwing in color really quickly because I've been doing a lot of talking, not a lot of art making. So I had my fish right here that, remember, I had made the perspective in such a way where the fish was gonna be the largest object in this image with, I mean, it's not actually the largest object in the space, but for the perspective that it's in, just so that we could have it shining and have the most attention on it that I could get. And the good thing about these markers is that you can layer them really well, so I can make this cutting board a little bit darker than my fish. And I'm thinking about right here that I have this backlit window coming in, so I'm gonna have rim lighting on a lot of my objects in here, so I'm gonna already start planning that out. So I'm not gonna shade this all the way to the edge of the fish, and I have this little lemon next to him too, that I'm just gonna shade like the body of without hitting the edges, leaving a little bit of a rim lighting. And so I get those in. I think I'm also gonna get this book in right here. I wanted to make sure that the book and this man's face and his skin were kind of similar in value, because I wanted to help imply the fact that it was in shadow. And I wanted him to have like a pretty dark sweater. I originally planned to him have a blue sweater, and then I was like, well, maybe it's like a dark subdued blue, which I did a final illustration for this, which I'll show you guys, but that was the neutral gray. I'm gonna pick up a little bit of a darker gray here. I think I'm gonna do neutral gray 7, and I'm gonna start hitting some areas of his sweater here to help distinguish it from this book a little bit more, and help distinguish it from his face and everything too. So I'm gonna start to get that in there. And this is like really a stage where you shouldn't worry too much about details still. Like obviously I had done like a more detailed sketch of this, but just when you're putting in your colors and putting in your values, I'm not gonna really worry about this bookshelf that's back here too much, because it's not gonna be really the focus of this illustration. So I'll show you guys really quick. I want this wall to be darker. It's a little bit further away from the window, and I don't really want any of the objects back here to stand out. They're a part of my story, but they're not the main part. So I'm gonna try to make everything on this back wall kind of in a similar value range. So I'm gonna pick up, I think, neutral gray 6. I want it to be a little bit lighter than his sweater, but I still want it to be fairly dark since it's not lit particularly well. So I'm gonna go in here, and if you want any tips too on how to do this kind of like backlighting, it took me forever to figure out, as you could tell. But something that's really helpful is that it only works in the context of shadows. So like as soon as I start putting in these shadows of this wall right behind him, or when I start putting in the colors around this fish here, that's when the highlights really start to stand out. And that's when they really start to show up and read as, you know, rim lighting rather than just this guy has like a really light edge around him for some reason. So I'm gonna throw in color really quick. I'm not even gonna really worry about keeping these washes super consistent because I just care about the value right now. I don't care about making this look super good. And I want the bookshelf to stand out just a little bit, be a little bit darker. So I'm just gonna go over it once more with this marker, have it show up a little bit more. Really just scribbling things in at this point. And this will be a great reference for when, if I had done this before I did my actual illustration painting, this would have been so helpful. I'm sad that I didn't, but we learn, and I'm teaching you so that you can know too, not to do what I did. I even had a little couch here. A note on references for your image. Some people are very good with just coming up with things from their imagination, and that's something that takes a lot of practice and time. If that's something you struggle with, I want everyone to know that it is always okay to use references, and everyone uses references, even professional artists that draw every day. I mean, I use references all the time. Emmy uses references all the time. I don't know any artists that don't use references with their artwork. This is a cool gray one. I'm actually going to start throwing in some colors in this window because I know I want it to be really bright and I want it to be kind of cool since it's like morning light that's coming. But anyway, references are very important. Even if, like, from almost, I don't think there's anything, except for, no, really, there's nothing in this image that I copied exactly from a reference. There are many things that I copied very closely, like the knife that you see right here. I wanted it to have a wooden handle, and so I painted it brown, but in my actual reference image, I took the reference myself from a knife that we had here. It had a purple handle, and so I had to alter that a bit, but I had to get like the correct perspective that I wanted to make this knife look realistic, and so I had to find a good photo for it. So I'm gonna shade a little bit more of this cool blue in here. You can see I actually did, I'm jumping around a lot bit here. So if I like start a thought and you're like, where's that thought going? And then I jump to a completely different tangent and you're like, wait a minute, where's that thought going? Please point it out in the comments and let me know so I can answer whatever I was gonna say to you if you're interested in where my thoughts were going. Anyway, I'm all over the place. I wanted to like make this room in context with this image. I didn't just want to have the dragon in. It could have been a completely different place. It could have been a completely different dragon since like barely any of him is showing. So something I wanted to do is to make sure that you could tell it's the same scene from this little window right here. And you can, I'm gonna lift it up for you guys because I realize you're probably struggling to see it. If I could get it to focus, there it is. You can see just barely that I put the same cabin in the background here. And I kept kind of that wispy, lake vibes that this image has so that I could put it in context so that they worked better as a pair and you had a little more context for the environment that this was happening in. They really worked together as a pair. So where was I going before I started on that tangent? That's the question I ask myself every single day. Okay, I'm gonna keep throwing in colors here. I think I gotta figure out what color this back wall is gonna be. And I want it to be a little bit lighter and a little bit cooler than this wall. So I think I'm gonna go for a cool gray. And I believe I used neutral gray 7 for that wall. So I think I wanna go in with a, maybe like a cool gray 5 or, oh, there's cool gray 5, excellent. And I'm gonna do the same thing I did here where it's like, I'm not gonna really focus. He has a little chair behind him. He has a little image behind him, painting image. I'm just not gonna really focus on those. And I'm just gonna shade right over them because I want them to be a similar value so that they don't stand out in this image. The things that I wanna give the most contrast, the most difference in value are the things that I wanna highlight in my story, which is like this old guy right here, the fish, and kind of the window. So these other stuff in the background where they like help make an interesting story, they help kind of round things out, they're not as important, so I'm not gonna give them a whole lot of value. Difference in value, I should say. They have value, so. And by the way, these are alcohol markers. If you want to print out little images like this, you should probably do it on a laser printer rather than an inkjet printer because the alcohol in these markers can dissolve that ink. And kind of, you can have like a runny image, which isn't the thing I'm most concerned about for just like little thumbnails like this. But just as a heads up, if you decide to do this, or if you decide to do this and have it as like your final illustration, which you could definitely do. I did my final, I'm all over. I did my final illustration in acrylic gouache because that's just a medium I really like and I really enjoy painting, so I wanted to bring painting into this. And I wanted to show you guys another medium that's commonly used for illustration. But if you want to use Artfinity markers for your final illustration, you want to like print out your sketch like this, you definitely can. Just make sure you use a laser printer, not an inkjet printer. Otherwise your lines will be all runny. So I gotta make sure there's a little wall here, and hopefully you guys are able to see what I'm drawing a little bit better now that I got a bunch of values in here. And I need to get this table. I want the table to be, I think, slightly lighter than the fish and the cutting board. But still like a neutral gray, warmer than this background that's going on here. And I'm almost doing, if you can notice, I'm almost doing like an L shape with my warmer colors and a little box right here with my cooler colors. That's part of like leading your eye around and part of like just getting it so like the window and the light from the window is affecting this wall, but also the rest of this environment here is kind of separate from that. There's other things being told in this L shape in my composition than there are in this little box right here. So there's just a little bit of separation. I don't know if I explained that very well. Let me know if that was confusing. So that was neutral gray 7. I want definitely lighter than that. Neutral gray 4, that might have been what I used for the fish. So I'm gonna grab a neutral gray 3 and see if that works. Yeah, I think it does. And I'll put a little bit, I'm gonna have a little bit of a cast shadow from my cutting board here. So I'll make sure to layer that in. I'm gonna have a little bit of shadow right here, so I'm gonna make it a little bit darker. And I'm actually gonna start putting, I need to put little details in this knife. So this knife is reflecting a lot of the light around it. It's a shiny surface. So I'm gonna use the same color I used for the table. Make it a little bit darker, as if it's like reflecting this cutting board a bit. Throw that in, and maybe I'll even like shade the handle in a bit while I'm here. Oh, and I forgot to put the rim lighting. There will be rim lighting on this knife. I didn't put it in here. Okay, I think that's good. And then I need to get these final bits here. So I need a very dark neutral gray. This is kind of like the underneath the table area. That I decided to leave this area, it ended up being larger in my finished painting, this dark area underneath this table here. And I decided to leave it without, like I didn't hint at the underside of this table or anything. I decided to just leave it black. Because as you can probably tell, I had a lot of stuff going on in my composition. There's a lot of places for your eyes to be led around. And I kind of wanted to have a blank space for your eye to rest. And that sounds kind of confusing because it's not like your eyes are getting tired out when you're dancing around this image or whatever. But it's kind of like when you have so much going on in an image, it can kind of be exhausting to look at. There's no place for you to just like take in and absorb the information almost. And that is kind of a confusing way to put things. But if you just have a larger area where there's not a lot going on, accompanied with like an area where there is a lot going on, that's gonna make things a lot more approachable to people. So I wanted to have some areas of this painting where there wasn't really any detail at all and there wasn't much going on. Now I just need to get this side of the table. And I think we should be good. Actually, I think I'm gonna use the neutral gray 7 for that one too. We just had something fall down. I'm not sure what it was. Some batteries. Whoop. So apologies for the batteries that just fell from the table. So I'm just getting the edge of my table in here. I think I'm even going to suggest the little cast shadow for this knife just so it stands out a little bit more. And underneath the table isn't quite dark enough compared to that, so I think I got to darken it up more. Okay, and maybe I'll get a little bit of the details. Like I'll get this fish's eye in, and I'll get like the lip of his mouth in there and everything, and maybe a little bit of his shadow on the cutting board. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm gonna end this value study. It's not gonna get much more complex than that. Actually, I just realized I forgot to fill in the dragon and the bird and this little house, which is an important piece. So really quickly, I think I'm gonna grab a cool gray 3 and I'm just gonna fill those in because those are important parts of the story. I wanna make sure I get their values correct. So I'm gonna draw in my little bird here. Again, I'm gonna give him just a slight rim lighting. That's really hard to see. I'll hold this up in a second once I get it done for you guys. I wanted to make sure this was small so I could get it done in a fast enough time. Okay. Okay. Hold this up so you guys can see it a bit better. Make sure it's in focus. Okay. So you can kind of see here, we have this little bird sitting in the window. We have this little dragon, a big dragon actually, and he's kind of grasping at the windowsill. I decided that just so like, if it was only the muzzle, I felt like it wasn't suggesting enough of what was happening, which is why I decided to put him almost grasping, like he's holding on, suggesting that he might still come through this window, even though we're not drawing him like fully coming in anymore. And then we have this much lighter, cooler area and a warmer, darker area kind of right here. So that was the composition I decided to go with for this. After you kind of get your value stage done, that is when you can jump into color. So I mean, you can do it in any order that you like, but this is the way that works kind of best for my brain. So I have another little thumbnail here, This one is done on New York Central watercolor paper. So now we can bring out our acrylic gouache. So let me pull all of this to the side. I have a million things pulled out on this table right now. Okay, I had used, I believe this is the Earth set of Turner acrylic gouache for this. So I'm gonna stick to that. And I'm not gonna make this as detailed as my final painting. Again, we're just throwing in colors here and we're using kind of our value scale as a reference for this. So I got little palettes that I have out here. I even have, you can see all these bottles I'm about to show you are very messy because I was doing a lot of painting and I kind of made them very messy, but I highly recommend if you get a set of acrylic gouache and you really like it, you use it and you really like it, that you get a giant like applesauce packet like this of the white acrylic gouache, because you will burn through white when you're doing this kind of painting. And these applesauce packets, I know it's not an applesauce packet, but that's what it reminds me of. They bring me so much joy. I love this thing. You can see I covered it in paint while I was working. But I highly recommend, if you're really into acrylic gouache, get yourself a set and then get yourself one of these. It is really good. So what I ended up doing predominantly in this painting is that I kind of stuck to a color mix that I really liked. I'm gonna make sure, I gotta move things around so I don't, you can see in this painting here, I had it sitting out on my table and I actually splattered it with paint after it was finished. You can see little specks. I need to clean it up, but one of the reasons I did that is because I had my water basin sitting way too close to it. So I'm trying to make sure right now that I don't have this water basin sitting next to anything that I think is important. Okay, so I have these side by side. I'm gonna try to do this real fast. Let me make sure I get my rag out here too. Okay, the color mixture that I kind of stuck with the most, you can see this painting, it is predominantly ultramarine and burnt sienna. And that is one of my favorite color mixes because it makes this really nice muted gray and can also mix a really beautiful black. And that's my favorite way to mix black. And I kind of wanted to keep a similar vibe in this, but I wanted this back window area to predominantly be that same kind of color scheme. So ultramarine, burnt sienna, both of which actually, this set does not have an ultramarine and does have a burnt sienna. So I ended up using almost all of this tube, which is why I brought out this much bigger one. So I'm gonna mix that really, really quickly. And I ended up using a very, very light mixture of this. So I have to make sure I add a lot of white in while I'm painting. And pro tip with acrylic gouache, which many of you who are acrylic painters, actually let me bring my palette into view here so you guys can see this. Watch me mix this. I mean, many of you who do acrylic paintings probably already do this to some extent. I know it's kind of controversial to use water as a medium for acrylic paint, but for acrylic gouache, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily using it as a medium, but I like to just have my brush just a little bit damp instead of mixing dry or painting dry. I find that just helps things apply a lot smoother. I don't really like texture in my paintings, and sometimes you can get a little bit of texture when you're just painting with what is essentially a dry brush, even though you get plenty of like wet paint here. So I like to make sure it's just a little bit damp. It also helps to get like a little bit of a thinner application. You want to be careful. The reason it's controversial to mix water in as a medium for acrylic is that it can kind of break apart the acrylic polymer, the binds in the acrylic polymer, and it can make things really grainy and uneven. So that's kind of why, and the same thing can happen for acrylic gouache, but you just got to get that littlest bit of water in, and you can get a really thin, opaque layer of it, which is, I think the thin layers is really important if you're like me and you go over things a million times like I did in that other painting. That will save you. I think there's some details in that painting I showed you guys where things kind of got muddied out, where I had applied paint a little too thick. And so that's really when the cracking started happening. So I like to just have a little bit of a damp brush and make sure there's not too much paint on my brush. So I'm mixing paint right now. You can use a palette knife for this if you like. I put these little stacking palettes in the teacher's cart because these are palettes I really love to use at home. There's like 3 more of these kind of stacking palettes that you can get. I like them so much because they cover up my paint. So if my cats get in my studio area, it's not a big deal. They're not licking paint. Okay, so you can kind of see here, it makes this really beautiful, like toned down gray. I put a little bit more ultramarine blue in this because I want it to be nice and cool. I'm gonna make sure I knock off some of the paint on my brush so it's not totally loaded. And in this little basin right here that you can see has ridges in this side of it that I like to use to knock the paint off. It's super helpful for acrylic painting. Highly recommend that. So I'm going to take just a little bit of this. And I might even want it to be a little more pale so that I can get closer to the value that I have right there. Knock some of the paint off. Yes?
Nola on Facebook is wondering if you have a preferred size when you're working on your thumbnails versus your studies versus your final piece.
I don't really.
Substrate.
Preferred size of substrate. So typically when I'm doing thumbnails, it's just on sketch paper, just so I can do a lot of them very quickly. And I actually think that's way too dark for what I wanted. So I might actually use this paint for my dragon and my bird and everything here, but I'm probably going to go over that. But no, I don't really have a preferred size. I try to make sure my thumbnails are the same ratio of whatever the final image is going to be. That's going to make it really easy for when you plan out your composition, so you don't have to move things around because your ratio changed. But other than that, no. I like this size was helpful. Ideally, I might have actually done this a bit. Actually, this is a good size for me for what I'm doing right now, since I scanned in a detailed sketch and now I'm planning out. This is, I think, a 5x7 almost. For when I'm just planning out values and colors and everything. I think this is a decent size, but I don't have a particular favorite. Recently, I've been trying, for my final paintings, I've been trying to work larger. Because when I was in like middle school and high school, I would only draw really, really small. And I mean really, really small. Like my sketchwork would be this big. And that's how, like that was as large as any final pieces I did ever got. It was like 5x7. So everything I drew was very small and detailed. So I've been trying to draw a little bit, work a little bit bigger recently. Okay, so I'm just putting in some colors. And I'm kind of, this acrylic gouache is super opaque, so it's gonna blow out any of the ink or details that I have in here. So I'm almost gonna paint around them a little bit, because some of these details I don't wanna lose because I wanna have them in mind for when I do my final painting. So I'm not gonna paint absolutely everything in this. I'm just gonna throw color down to make sure things look right. And I'm gonna mix a bit more white into this so I can get that background color going the way I want it to. And kind of paint over. Acrylic gouache dries very quickly. So you don't have to worry about waiting a long time before you have to put new colors in. And I think that's much more like what I want this color to be. I almost want it to be like foggy mountains in the background. So let me just throw this down. Yeah, I'm gonna do this very quickly because we only have 15 minutes left. Whoa. And I need to make sure I try to get as much of this done as possible. I'm gonna show you guys what my final painted ended up, blah, blah, blah. I'm gonna show you guys what my final painting, I can't say painting, I only say painted. My final painting ended up being, I gotta remember to keep painting while I'm talking too. So if we don't get through all of this, it's okay. I just wanted to give you guys an example of walking through the process. So I think what's important right here is I'm gonna show you guys how you can mix some skin tones really quickly. And the way I always mix skin tones is just starting out with primaries, because I find that's the easiest way. And the primaries I'm going to use for this aren't true primaries, but I'm going to use a permanent red, a cad yellow light, and an ultramarine. And this is a cad yellow light hue, so it's not actual cadmium. So don't be concerned if I get this on my hands. For those of you who don't know, cadmium is toxic. And so you want to handle it very carefully when you're working with paint. So I'm going to get a bit of yellow in and a bit of red in. I'm also going to need some white because this guy is pale. So I used a lot of this paint, which is why it's not squeezing out a lot right now, because these are practically empty. I blew through a lot of acrylic gouache doing these paintings and a tiny bit of blue. Okay, so this man's skin tone, I don't have his reference image with me, but he was like pale. He has a similar skin tone to I do, so like pinky, but we don't want it to be like a true pink or a true orange. So we want that little bit of blue in there. So I'm gonna make sure my brush is just a little bit damp. And I almost forgot, well, I'm gonna mix these three colors together in the ratios I think they should be, and then I'm gonna add white, but I'm gonna show you guys first. I think, judging on this guy's skin tone, I think it should probably be, the ratio should probably go the most red, then second yellow, and then the least amount of blue, is how I'm thinking that it should go for what this guy's skin tone is. So I'm gonna mix my red and yellow in there to start getting a bit of an orangey color. And then I'm gonna add a littlest bit of blue. There's lots of different ways, and you can already see that is a little more, well, I think it's gonna be a little too blue. It's not gonna be pinky enough for this guy's skin tone. I'm also gonna throw my white out right now because I'm gonna need to mix white in to get his skin tone. That would actually make a really nice skin tone, but not matched well enough to my reference image and what I ended up going with, so we're unfortunately not going to use it. So I'm going to knock some of that color off. I think I'm gonna mix in just a little bit more red. That might have been too much because I'm mixing a very small amount right now. Okay, but I'm gonna throw that white in there so I can start getting a better idea of what this color looks like. Now that's pretty good. Comparing it to my own right now. That's a pretty good color right there for the skin tone. And my reference image, we shaded it out here, but as I originally talked about, he was lit from the front. And so it was really kind of the reverse of what I did here. This little side part of his face was what was in shadow, and then this part was what was lit. So all I did is that I reversed that, and I tried to make sure that I changed the value accordingly. So I'm gonna put this color right here, which I believe is what his skin in light would look like, just right on the side of his face right here. It's a pretty pale color. And I'm gonna leave just the tiniest sliver right there for the rim lighting where it's gonna be like its purest, brightest white. And then I'm gonna try and make a slightly darker hue of this to do his face in shadow. So I'm gonna work from that. I'm gonna add in a little bit more blue, a little bit more red. It's almost gonna be kind of purpley. But to keep him from looking like a tomato, I'm gonna make sure I get that right amount of blue and yellow mixed in there. And let's see, that's a little bit closer to what I want. I'm gonna try to start out lighter and work darker. And I might even water this down so that I can still kind of see some of the details in his face because I don't totally want to blow them out. But I'm gonna just put next to a cheek there. I think that might work. Let's see. Can you guys see this well? Can everyone see this in the chat? See what we're working with? I'm gonna make sure you guys aren't just staring at me do tiny little details on a very blown out sketch right now.
Oh yeah, we can see.
Okay, sweet. Okay. So I'm gonna paint a little bit around some of the details here. I think this will work for his face in shadow. And I'm just gonna very carefully, this guy has a beard, but his beard was very pale and white and kind of like sparse. So I didn't really want to make like a whole different bushy area for his beard. I didn't want his beard to be a drastically different value from the rest of his face. I find that that can kind of happen when you're illustrating people with beards, is that you almost want to make it, if they don't have a super thick beard, it's almost going to be super similar to their skin tone. So I ended up kind of leaving that out, like hinting at it in my sketch lines? Sketch lines? There's a different term for that I'm forgetting right now. But not like really going into it, but I'm just trying to figure out color and value because it's not going to be something that's super important for what's happening when I do my larger illustration. So this looks really funny right now. Remember, it's going to look really funny, but it's going to be super helpful for when you're figuring things out. And I actually gave this guy in my drawing here, my reference image did not have this little pair of spectacles that he's wearing, but I decided that it would just be more fun if he had them. So I did put them in there. That's kind of what I think his face and his skin color should be. Keep in mind that it'll all work in context. And even I think a tip here is like if you squint your eyes while you're looking at something, even if it's a colored image, it's going to help you a lot more see the values. And I think I went too dark there for what I drew in here. But we're going to keep on going because we got limited time. So I would lighten that up ideally. But I'm going to focus on trying to get a sweater and maybe trying to get, I'll get these walls here so we can fill in some color really quick. Or if there's anything specific on this image that you want to see me paint in, like if you really want to see me paint the fish, let me know and I will get that. So I think I'm going to go back to my colors here. Another thing with acrylic gouache or acrylic is that it will dry out on your palette, but if you spritz it every once in a while with a really nice spray bottle like this one, it'll keep things kind of going. You just got to make sure again that you don't end up adding too much water. and things get a little bogged down. And I actually think that is my ultramarine, which I don't think I want to do for this mixture. I think the mixture that I ended up doing was manganese blue with burnt sienna, slightly different. So this manganese blue is just a little bit warmer. It also has another pigment in it that the ultramarine does not have. So it creates a mix that's just a little bit muddier, but a little bit warmer, and that's kind of what I wanted for these back walls behind this guy. I just got a bunch of dust on him from like the paint had dried around the cap. So I'm gonna put that manganese blue, actually I think I'm just gonna mix it right here next to the burnt sienna. And I think I'm just gonna start mixing that in together. And again, it'll create kind of like a dulled out tone, but it's just a little bit warmer than my ultramarine, so it's gonna help a little bit getting like the warm kind of feeling I wanted from this room separate from the cooler feeling of the background. And this burnt sienna really plows through any blue that I mix it with. Like it always turns out way warmer than I think it should be, so I gotta add in a little bit more manganese.
Facebook is interested in how you're gonna address the cutting board if you wanna paint that one.
Adjust it?
Address.
Oh, address. Okay, I misheard. Yeah, let's do that. Okay.
And YouTube had one question about the porcelain palettes that you're actually using. They love those, and they were wondering how much paint it could hold while you're stacking it.
A decent amount. Like, I'm not worried about, I guess right up to, it could hold a lot. I'm looking at it right now, and this is concave, right? So even if I put my hand over this, like it's gonna hit paint that was right on the edge here, but it's not gonna hit everything in the middle there. I'm really tempted to just squeeze a bunch out and show you guys how much it could.
Space on the underside too, right?
Yeah, you can flip this around as well, and it's a little bit deeper there. And luckily I'm using acrylic, so I'm not worried about this falling out into my hand. It's like, what is that ice cream place that does the flip?
Good berries.
Good Berries, is that what does it?
Dairy Queen.
Dairy Queen.
They both do them.
Dairy Queen, yeah, they do the little choo-choo. Could do it with your acrylic. And I just got paint all over my hand. Okay. Do we have Soho wipes really quickly? Otherwise I'm gonna get paint over everything. Okay, I'm gonna keep going and plow through the absolute mess on my hand right now. But I mixed this kind of warm, almost greenish tone right here. And I'm gonna start throwing it into our background really quickly. So that will help. I think that's too dark, so I'm gonna use it over here. Getting our background in really fast will help help us visualize what the values should be for the objects up here. So I did a little bit, like I'm going around the little details that I put on top of this bookshelf right now, but I'm not totally concerned with getting all those tiny details in there. Thank you. I'm gonna wipe off my hand really quick. Soho wipes. They even work on oil paints, but they don't have anything toxic in them. So it's okay to use them on your hands. So I'm gonna make sure I get all of that off really quick. Otherwise I'm just gonna keep covering the table in paint. Okay, we should be good. I'm almost putting this paint in here, almost like watercolor or like a gouache right now. I've really thinned it down with this water, just so I'm not like absolutely obscuring all the details I put down. But I think that's pretty good for the value that I put down here. I'm gonna make sure I scoot this up so you guys can see what I'm doing. There we go, that's a bit better. Okay, and then I'm gonna mix a little bit more white into it so that we can get the value of that other wall really quickly. It's a bit better. And then I'll do our cutting board and our little fish guy, so you can kind of see what that would look like. I'm really just throwing paint down at this point. I'm not totally concerned with getting all these little fine details. Okay, I might just do that for now. I would probably go a little more carefully if we had a bit more time, but I don't want to hold you guys over too long. So, cutting board. I want this cutting board to be like a wooden cutting board, so I'm gonna make sure it's a little bit more warm toned, and I wanted all the colors over here to be a little bit more warm anyway, but I'm gonna do the same mixture that I'm actually doing back here for the walls, where it's the manganese blue and the burnt sienna. I'm just gonna make sure I have a bit more burnt sienna than I do manganese blue, so it's a bit warmer, and I'm actually gonna hold some of this paint over here so I'm not absolutely mushing all this mixtures around, getting my mixture super muddy. So it's a bit of a warmer color. I'm gonna make sure I add a bit more white into it. You can already see how much white I'm blowing through just doing this. So I can get kind of closer to the value I want for that cutting board, but more of a warm tone. Okay, I think that's close. I like holding up the paint on my bristles next to it to see if it's close in value, but it's also gonna look different as soon as you put it on paper. And there you go. You can see how drastically different this color is than the color on the wall, even though it was the same two colors that mixed. So I'm gonna throw down my cutting board here. And I actually made it so that this cutting board, it was very similar in value to the fish, but I wanted them to be completely different colors. So I'll show you on my final illustration that I ended up painting this fish like almost a bright blue, kind of mimicking some of the coloring that was going on in this window, just so that you can like kind of pair the connection of them together in your brain, if that makes any sense. Just kind of like color, if we see things with like similar colors or similar hues, even if they're completely different values, our brain likes to mix them together, not mix them, but connect them together and try to find similarities or connections in their meaning when we're looking at paintings. And artists will often do that. They'll find two objects that they want to relate together in meaning or in some other case, and they'll make them the same color so that you can kind of already get hints that they should be related somehow. So that's kind of what I wanted to do by making this fish like bright blue. Plus, a lot of fish are blue, so it makes sense. Okay, I think I'm gonna get the value of my table down really fast, and then I'm gonna show you guys what I ended up with. So if you have any final questions, feel free to ask them now. Another thing right here that I wanted to mention is that if you're interested in building compositions like this, if you want a little more information on it, or if you want a little more information on how to tackle values when you're creating your own compositions, we did do a show a while back. I did a show a little while back on crafting landscape compositions. I had written down the class code for that one, but I forgot what it was, so I am sorry to our moderators. But it was crafting landscape compositions, where it's helpful for anything, even if you're not doing landscapes necessarily. But if you just want to look at how you can create value structure and kind of change your composition to be more interesting for what you want, that is a good show to look at. So I got kind of my table thrown on in there. This is an absolute mess. I'm sorry that we didn't get to get more of this done. But before we go, I wanted to show you guys what I ended up with. So I'm gonna move these off to the side a bit. I'm gonna move my acrylic gouache out of the way. And this is on a DaVinci Pro panel if any of you are interested. But this is what my final illustration ended up being. So you can kind of see I had a lot more warm tones in the foreground here. My fish is very similar in color to what's going on here, so you can kind of draws your attention to them, but I also have this rim lighting that's happening. I got the shadow on his face so he didn't look completely like a tomato. And yeah, that's what I ended up with. He's laughing at me right now. And I got to play around with some fallen color too. So in these little areas right here, since I had this super strong rim lighting, if you ever look, I mean, it might hurt your eyes a little bit, but if you ever look at something that's like lit very strongly from behind and doesn't have any other lighting sources, you might notice that right around the edges of that rim lighting, there's really intense saturation of color, which is why I ended up putting in little hints of like reds and blues here, which I feel like they fit well in the illustration without drawing too much attention to them, but it kind of gives that idea that there's a really intense light that's coming through this window. I liked that detail. I had a lot of fun doing that, and I even put, this is kind of where I had a fun time with the details. I even put my own name on one of the books right here. I don't even think I can show you guys on the camera, it's so tiny. But yeah, and then I had his cookbook is My Dragon Cooks, and it has a little dragon and then a fork, a knife, and a spoon and everything. So yeah, and I'll show you, where did I put, oh there it is. How they kind of go together. If I can just barely fit them both into my camera, and those were my two illustrations. So thank you guys so much for coming. If we have any final questions, ask them now, but if we don't get to them, if you had any other questions, I will be going back through the chat tomorrow and answering everything that you might want to know. So don't worry if you didn't get your question asked or answered. That's what I should say. But thank you guys again so much for coming. If you want to see any of the supplies that I used for that I used tonight on the show, again, go to the website, JerrysArtarama.com, and type in the class code JL305 into the search bar. That's where you'll be able to find all this. If you want to join our Facebook Live group if you decide to do your own illustrations, if you want to talk about illustration or any of that, or any of the other shows, Jerry Live shows that we have done in the past, if you have artwork for that or just personal artwork that you would like to post there and share with the community, please join our Facebook Live group. Just make sure you answer the security question, otherwise we will deem you a robot and not let you in. So, join us next week. It's going to be a Facebook-only show. It's going to be a vendor show with Daniel Smith. We are going to be with Giovanni Balzerani. I probably pronounced his name wrong. I am so sorry. But he's going to be talking about water media between watercolor and gouache. I'm really excited for it, so please join us there. And yeah, I had a great time, everyone. I love talking about illustration. And bye!